Shabbat Shalom, everybody. I feel like we have some special opportunities in Boulder to have really wonderful scholars passing through, and it's a real honor and privilege to have someone who I definitely consider a friend and a mentor in some ways and a chavruta in other ways. And Rabbi Or Rose, it's interesting because the very first word of the section of the Talmud that talks about Pesach, the first word is Or, which happens to be his name. And as we think about getting ready for Pesach and the light that comes into it when sometimes it's quite hard, I think of all of the light that Or brings through his scholarship and through his menschlichkeit. Or grew up really with Reb Zalman, who so many of us here knew and loved really as his uncle, and really grew up on his knee and was very, very close to Reb Zalman growing up because his father is also a rabbi, who was like a brother to Reb Zalman for many, many years. And so Or has that very deep connection to Zalman. We think of him as Reb Zalman. He was like, what did you call him?
Uncle Zalman.
Uncle Zalman, right, exactly. So Uncle Zalman. So Or is a founding member of the rabbinic faculty of Hebrew College Rabbinical School, where Rav Jacob was ordained in June, and they worked closely together on Jacob's capstone project. Also, Rav Sarah Bracha was also an ordinee of Hebrew College. And it's wonderful to have you with us, and I'm going to stop talking and watching you. We have some source sheets here. Not enough one each, but enough for probably to share between two or three. Well,
as we pass a nigun, not nusach, but a nigun. Yalla, 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 Good Shabbos. It is both a pleasure and an honor to be with you on this Shabbat of Vayikra, and to follow on Mark's warm welcome and words of introduction. It is particularly meaningful for me to be here in this synagogue space, knowing that my teacher, my Rebbe, Reb Zalman, was a regular member of this community and especially liked to be here for Torah reading days during the week, and I came with him a few times, earlier than I usually get up in the mornings. But for your teachers, you do certain things. And it feels like the shalshelet, the chain of transmission and of connection, is very strong because it's intergenerational. As Mark said, we're good and old friends, even though we think we're both still in our 20s, but we are good and old friends. And then, of course, my beloved student, your newish rabbi and father, Jacob, is now here. And then in addition, the Dor Vador, I have the honor and the pleasure of being here this morning with some of the students that I'm getting to know from Europa. So it really does feel like a bracha, a real blessing that is overflowing to be here this morning. You might recall that in 1990, the Dalai Lama made the call to the Jewish community and asked if a delegation of Jewish leaders from North America and Israel would dialogue with him and his leadership group about the Jewish secret of survival. the Dalai Lama, who was at that point probably the most popular religious or spiritual figure in the world, had the wherewithal, the wisdom, and the humility to reach out and to ask of Jewish leaders, how have you done it? We Tibetan Buddhists have been in exile for a matter of decades. You have endured exile for thousands of years. So please share with us. They met in New York City, and then, of course, famously, a year later in Dharamsala, and you know much of that story through The Jew in the Lotus and other tellings of it. Person after person, in different ways, in different shapes, in different forms, Reb Zalman, of course, quite colorfully, explained that the secret of Jewish survival has been the ability to hold the tension between what one of Reb Zalman's teachers, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel of blessed memory, called the responsibility to at once serve as inheritors and innovators. And I think on this Shabbat of Vayikra, as Mark was saying earlier, when we look back, when we explore teachings about the sacrificial cult from the ancient world, part of the challenge, of course, is to ask ourselves, how are we both connected, and where will that connection lead us forward? And here is one answer from a great Hasidic master. His name was Rabbi Moshe Chaim Ephraim of Sadukov, and he was the grandson of the spiritual founder of Hasidism, that being Yisrael ben Eliezer, the Baal Shem Tov. The Degel, as he is often referred to, was a more introverted Hasidic leader than others, and he spent much of his last decades teaching small groups, delivering Divrei Torah, and working diligently on a commentary on the Torah. He was quite convinced that as Hasidism began to grow, that it needed to articulate, among other things, its devotion to Torah. But as you'll see, he's engaged in that same dance of inheritance and innovation. So I chose two short sermonettes from this collection, the Degel Machane Ephraim, which was published 10 years after his death and is now considered a classic among Hasidim and those of us, by extension, that are a part of that world of study and devotion. As Mark alluded to earlier, one of the immediate things that people take notice of when they open the Chumash to this week's parasha is what the rabbis in the Gemara call the Aleph Ze'irah. There is calligraphically this oddity. Vav, Yud, Kuf, Resh are all written in normal-sized font, but the Aleph is much smaller. You can imagine that such an oddity is a source of delight for commentators across space and time. And the Degel is no different. But what you'll notice here, in a kind of more transparent way than you often see in these kinds of homilies, he's addressing a situation of his own time and place quite explicitly. Vayikra Adonai el Moshe. And God called to Moses. Why, asks the Degel, is the word Vayikra written here with a small aleph? My understanding, he goes on to say, is based on what I heard from Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polinoy of blessed memory. Yaakov Yosef of Polinoy was one of the closest disciples of the Baal Shem Tov, and he in fact published the first collection of sermons, Toldot Yaakov Yosef, of the Hasidic movement. It was the first collection of Hasidic Torah. And the grandson here, the Degel, actually grew up for a time with the Baal Shem Tov in the same house. And then teachers like Yaakov Yosef of Polnoi became very important to him. So clearly this drasha was given after the death of Yaakov Yosef, sometime between 1783 and 1800. The movement of Hasidism was just blossoming. People in our community, and it's interesting here, as Hasidim often do, he says, people in the oilam. He wasn't talking about the globe. His sense of geography and of community was much more limited. People in our community, the oilam, say, the scholars study Torah, but the Hasidim do not. Nicht. And he was so moved by whatever was agitating him about this statement, he actually wrote it in Yiddish. And most of these drashot, he and other masters insisted should be written in Hebrew. Why? Because it was Torah and has to be written in Lashon HaKodesh, in the Holy Tongue. But he was so exercised in this moment that he wanted to say it in the vernacular. People in the oilam say the following, that the loimdim are involved in Torah study and the Hasidim, not so much. Turn the page. In truth, the more these scholars study, the greater they appear in their own eyes. They think their learning is more than enough. The Hasidim are different. The more they learn, the smaller they become in their own eyes. In fact, all their learning is devoted to becoming humbler. We might add in square brackets, may it be so, for Misnagdim and Hasidim alike. And then he does something quite beautiful. The small aleph in the verse can be pronounced not as aleph, but as aluf, which we can translate as noble, which Torah study is, in fact. Torah study is intended to be humbling and ennobling. And with a wink, of course, he is saying to those that understand, remember that the Holy Blessed One, God, Father, King, Judge, Mother, is also referred to as Alufo Shel Olam, the Master of the universe, but here I think better articulated as the Noble One, the Humble One. And then he says, the purpose of our study is to learn how to humble and thus to ennoble ourselves. And with that he says, understand this, which is to say, I've said now more than enough. There are a few things that I want to pick up on here. One is that, following what I said before, I think it's important for us as spiritual seekers who also live with an historical critical consciousness to engage sources like this and to understand that we, like past generations within and across communities, struggled. Some of these people were brilliant. They had mastery of Torah, but they also struggled. And this is as clear an example as one can find from the early Hasidic period. We often romanticize and think of this period as one exclusively of great creativity, of great generativity. But remember, it was also a time of internal, intra-Jewish conflict. And this is a piece of that sifting and sorting and clarifying that involved real pain and struggle. I'm not celebrating that but I'm acknowledging it because I think that in itself is important to us as the latest links in this chain of transmission in the midst of what Mark referred to before as a time of chaos or a time of tumult. And so, where do we turn? To where do we return? To use the term of tshuva, return to Torah and to tefillah. And that was exactly the answer that this delegation of rabbis and communal leaders provided the Dalai Lama with. In fact, they used the example, of course, of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, and of the Beit HaMikdash, the temple in Jerusalem, and said, once that was destroyed, Jewish culture too could have been destroyed. But our ancestors were wise enough and agile enough to turn, to shift, and to create new sacred centers. New sacred centers that we could take with us to Babylonia, to Spain, back to the Galilee, to the Ottoman Empire, to Eastern Europe, and yes, to Boulder. The Torah becomes what scholars would describe as an axis mundi. It's that great place of spiritual power. It's not only text, but it's context. La'asok b'divrei Torah. For those of you that were here early, perhaps you said that bracha during Birchot HaShachar. Does not mean simply to study Torah, but it means to immerse in Torah, to marinate in Torah, to steep in Torah. And so the Degel here is asking the question, beyond the polemic, which I did want us to take note of, but more deeply, what does it mean to be a student of Torah? What does it mean to have the same kind of devotional focus when one studies Torah as we imagine when people went to the temple to offer sacrifices? Because Hasidism, after all, is designed as a devotional path. And the beginning of his answer here is anava, is humility. And as he imagines it, among the many things that we could say about the divine, including the Onion headline, is that in the process of revelation and covenant, what the Degel is saying here is that the Aleph Ze'irah is a symbol of the divine capacity to make space for others, to model humility relationally, so that when Moses descends from that mountain, Torah is now ours. And she is responsible for us, and we for her. A second teaching from the Degel. This is from Genesis, but as you'll see, it very much partakes of this Vayikra sensibility. And in fact, it references Vayikra. This is the book of the descendants of Adam. Let us begin with what I have taught elsewhere about the verse, Moses diligently sought out the goat for the sin offering. We'll soon come to that moment in the Torah. Tradition notes that these words, darosh, darash, diligently sought, or sought, truly sought, are the midpoint in a letter count of the Torah. Somewhere, someone, likely with OCD, counted every letter of the Torah and determined that the midpoint is darosh, darash. Seek, diligently seek, engage in midrashic experience. What does this suggest, asks the Degel. In my humble opinion, he says, The meaning is as follows. We know that the written Torah and the oral Torah are truly one. They cannot be separated from one another. Indeed, neither is possible without the other, since the written Torah reveals its secrets through oral interpretation. We have the Tanakh, we have the canon, but it is not sealed. We have no notion akin to what in some Christian communities is called sola scriptura. Simply, exclusively, the text of the Hebrew Bible. We understand that the two cannot be separated. Torah shebichtav and Torah shebe'al peh. The written Torah was like half a book. Darosh, darash. We've reached the middle. Now, in his expansive thought, he's applying the same notion to the entire Torah. It itself is only half of what it means to engage in Torah study. Until the sages came and interpreted, illuminating our eyes and revealing hidden secrets. Sometimes they would even uproot something from the Torah, as was the case regarding punishment by lashes. The Torah states, he shall be stricken 40 times. But the sages reduce it in Masechet Makot to 39. It's a simple example of the ways in which the rabbis, long ago and far away, not Reform Jews, not conservative Jews, not Reconstructionist Jews, not Orthodox Jews, were engaged in this process of receiving Torah and innovating with Torah. They did this through their Holy Spirit, Ruach HaKodesh, like the Bat Kol, which was manifest to them and gave them this power. The wholeness of the written Torah is thus dependent on the oral Torah. We come back to Leviticus. This is what the expression Darosh, Darash implies. The words of the written Torah were only half of the letters of the Torah. That is, until the sages interpreted them. Only then was it called a whole book. Darosh, Darash. The words on the page are only half of the story, so to speak. And then he says, with great bravery, so it is with each generation and its interpreters. They make the Torah whole, which is a beautiful statement because it's not as if the Torah is ever whole. The making of Torah whole is always a process that's unfolding. Torah is interpreted in each generation according to the specific needs and the soul root of that generation. God illuminates the eyes of each generation's sages to interpret his holy Torah. And then he says, with a measure of chutzpah, one who denies this is like one who denies Torah. Chas v'chalila. Perish the thought. But that's a kind of kfirut, he would say. That's heresy. And then he does another exegetical move that I think is just beautiful and brilliant. It is well known that King David is the symbol of oral Torah. Why is that so? Because Melech David, of course, was a poet and a musician. So much beauty came forth from his mouth, complicated as he was. And in Kabbalah, Melech David, King David, is associated with Shekhinah, with Malchut, the indwelling presence of the divine, which is the mouth of God speaking to the world. It's also often associated with the female indwelling presence of the divine, and therefore with the image of the vaginal canal, the birthplace of divine blessing. So Melech David is associated with oral Torah, the coming forth of holiness. It's also taught that David was originally fated to die in utero because he was such a complicated and problematic figure. There was a divine concern about whether or not this person should come to be. However, this is beautiful too, Adam Harishon, Adam gifted him with 70 years from his own lifespan so that King David was born. With all of this in mind, all of this symbolic and interpretive play, he winds down as follows. Applying these teachings, we can now explain the verse. This is the book of the descendants of Adam. Remember, that's where we started this mystical flight of fancy? So what does it now mean? This is the book. Sefer refers to the written Torah, which was made whole through the descendants of Adam. That is through King David, the symbol of Torah Shebe'al Peh, the oral Torah. And then he says in closing, David was truly, mamish, that's the word he uses, mamish, Adam's descendant. I bring these two texts to you because, as I said earlier, Torah is a sacred center. It is the place to which we turn and return, particularly, I want to say, in times of tumult. I had the pleasure this week of teaching and learning with the students and faculty at Naropa. And on Wednesday night, we had a Buddhist-Jewish dialogue. And of course, I had the Dalai Lama, I had Reb Zalman in heart and mind. And at the end of the evening, a student raised his hand, very agitated, and said to us panelists, and to Leah, who moderated so beautifully, you've been talking all evening about different spiritual practices, but the world is on fire. What is the relationship between the two? And each of us then proceeded to say in different ways, exactly. In these times that feel like they are so divisive, where violence seems to be carrying the day, where internally in the Jewish community, before we even engage with anyone beyond it, we find ourselves at terrible odds with one another. And so there has to be a dynamic interplay between action in the world and reflection, study, discernment, and an ability, of course, to hold both humility and creativity. And here I want to return to Birchot HaShachar and read to you something that many of us actually say every morning from Masechet Kiddushin. These are the deeds that yield immediate fruit and continue to yield fruit in the time to come. Honoring parents, performing deeds of kindness and love, attending the house of study morning and evening for prayer, providing hospitality, visiting the sick, helping the needy bride, attending the dead, probing the meaning of prayer, making peace between one person and another, and between husband and wife. And then lastly, the study of Torah is the most basic of them all. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom.